Let's now take a look at epithelial tissue. So a couple of important points. We know that epithelial tissue forms boundaries. That's the most important thing you need to understand here, is that epithelial tissue, or the cells that make up epithelial tissue, called epithelial cells, they together will form boundaries that separate out environments. So you'll find them often lining cavities, for example. Lining various cavities. And if we try and have a think, what are some cavities off the top of our head? Well, we've got different cavities like the abdominal cavity. We've got the thoracic cavity. Right? We've also got internal linings of, think of anything hollow. So what about the hollow tubes of our body? So the gastrointestinal tract, the reproductive tract, we could say the renal tract, so all the tubes associated with the kidneys, blood vessels. So anything that's hollow, in which you've got two separate environments that need to be separated out, we need to have epithelial cells that line those areas. Now there's many different types, and you can see those types here. If we were to just draw up really simply an epithelial cell like this, you'll find that there's the bottom part, and then there's the top part right there. Now the bottom part, called the basal aspect, is usually, or when I say usually, is always attached to some sort of connective tissue. And this is called the basal lamina. That's the connective tissue, which makes sense, basal lamina. And then the top, the one that's freely out, exposed to the cavity or the open environment, that's called the apical area. Now, sometimes you can have single lines of, or single rows of epithelial cells. And if we were to have single rows of epithelial cells, if we were to draw up here, a single row, we've got a cell like that, cell like that, cell like that, cell like that, cell like that. There's one row. We term this simple. So that's what we call a simple layer. You can have many layers. So you can have all these layers on top of each other like this, and it may be 2 or 3 or 4, for example, and we term that stratified. So if there's one layer, it's called a simple layer. If there's more than one layer, 2 or more, we call it a stratified layer. But there's more to it than just that. The shape of the epithelial cell. So some epithelial cells are squished like a pancake, and we call them, think of the squir in squished, we call them squamous. Some are shaped like a square or a cube, and they're termed cuboidal. And some are shaped like a column, and they're termed columnar. So you can see a couple of points here. One, you can have layers that are simple or stratified. There's actually another layer that we can add here that we term pseudo-stratified, where it looks like it's stratified, but in actual fact it's not. So it's still a single layer of cells, but it looks like there's actually more layers than there are. And that's what we call pseudo, meaning fake, pseudo-stratified. So in actual fact, you can have 3 layers. A simple layer, you can have a stratified layer, or you can have a pseudo-stratified layer. And then the cell, the epithelial cell that makes it up, they can be squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. Now, what we've got here is all the ingredients to make all the different types of epithelial tissue in the body. And the great thing about epithelia is you need to remember the following. Form equals function. Now, form equals function simply means the types of layers that are present and the types of cell shape gives you an indication as to what that tissue does. And you might be saying, but it forms a boundary. Sure, but some boundaries want to let things in, some boundaries don't want to let things in. Some boundaries want to release substances, some boundaries don't. And so we can have a look, and we've got them here, they're already pre-drawn for us, and we can have a look and see what these boundaries or what these epithelial tissues are going to likely function as. So let's first start with what we call a simple squamous epithelium. So first one is simple. What does that tell you? It's one layer. Squamous, what does that tell you? It's squished. So we've got one layer of squished cells. So what do you think this means? If you've got one layer of squished cells, what do you think its function is going to be? If it's really thin, right? So you've got an environment here, out here, and you've got an environment in here. It's going to be pretty easy for things to get through because it's only one layer and they're the thinnest cells you can get. So it's going to be super simple for things to go in and things to go out. And so that's the whole purpose of this particular layer. It's to let things through, either through diffusion or through filtration. So either through diffusion or filtration, it's there to let things through. So a nice example of this is going to be in the lungs. So this is going to be the lining of our lungs to let gases through, right? So to let oxygen into the lungs and let carbon dioxide out of the lungs as well. And you can also include blood vessels too, because we want things to pass through our blood vessels. Our blood vessels need to be able to feed nutrients to tissues, so things need to get through, but also gases as well. So this simple squamous epithelial layer, it's there to let things through for diffusion and filtration, and some locations that you can find include the lungs and blood vessels. Now, if we keep to the simple layer of things, let's now look at simple cuboidal. So one layer of cube-shaped cells. Now have a look at the difference between the cuboidal and the squamous. The size is different, and what that means is that there's a cuboidal, there's a squamous. All the internal structures, all the organelles and things that are inside here of the cuboidal, they can do stuff. Now the squamous, there's not much room for things to do. So there's no organelles inside the squamous, but there are organelles inside of the cuboidal. So they're present, so cuboidal cells are present when they need to either bring things inside and do something with it, or to produce something to let outside. So often these are in areas where we need to secrete and absorb. Secrete and absorb. And often you'll find these in ducts, so hollow tubes. So ducts are hollow, not ducts like quack quack, but ducts are hollow tubes, such as the hollow tubes of the kidneys, where we filter things. So an example of this includes that of the kidney tubules. Now, if we look at simple columnar, well, now we've got one layer of column-shaped cells. And what does this mean? Well, think about it. There's even more room for organelles to do stuff. So they're usually there because they like to secrete things like mucus and enzymes. So they secrete things like mucus and enzymes. But they can also play an absorptive role. They can absorb things as well. And so sometimes, now you can see, right on the very end, the apical side, you've got these little fingertip-like projections that are called cilia. And they're there to increase the surface area of the top of that cell. Why? This is the area where the cilia is. That's the area that's exposed to the cavity or the open environment. So if it wants to absorb something, if you have cilia, you increase the surface area for absorption. So it's more likely to absorb stuff. And a great example of this type of thing is the digestive tract. We really want to absorb stuff there, right? But other areas like the bronchus or bronchi, so the airways or certain parts of the airways, you'll find these simple columnar epithelium, often with cilia. Now let's have a look at pseudostratified epithelia. Really, really similar to columnar. The only difference is it looks like there's many layers, but there's not. And it plays the exact same role, right? Secretion, often of mucus and enzymes, and very little absorption in this case for the pseudostratified. And the respiratory tract is the major site that you're going to get this. Respiratory tract. All right, we've gone through these simple layers, the single layers. Now let's have a look at the stratified layers. So, stratified squamous. They look like bricks in a wall. Now think about it. Firstly, they're squamous, so there's no internal organelles, so they don't want to absorb anything and they don't want to secrete anything, right? That's the first thing. And then, it's not one layer, so it doesn't want things to get through diffusion or filtration. There's many layers. So it really wants to stop things from getting through. So you're going to have stratified squamous epithelial layers in areas of protection, areas that we need to protect from abrasion. So protect from abrasion. And that makes sense because if there's no organelles inside, it doesn't matter if you lose a couple. And this is what's lining our skin, for example. And our skin is exposed to the external environment, cuts, scrapes, things like that. We're going to lose skin, and that's okay because these cells are predominantly dead. There's nothing inside that we need, no organelles, for example. Let's have a look at stratified cuboidal. So again, it's there for protection, right? Because there's many layers, and when there's many layers, you have a good idea that it's going to be there for protection in some way. But it may also want to produce stuff. So, for example, sweat glands and salivary glands to secrete. So it's there for protection, but also secretion. So, sweat and saliva. You might be thinking, well, why aren't they just simple columnar or simple cuboidal if they want to secrete? Because they're in areas that need protection as well. So our salivary glands are in our mouth, and our mouth is exposed to foods that can damage it. And our sweat glands as well, it's part of our skin, right? So it needs some degree of protection. And then when we look at stratified columnar epithelium, you actually don't find these too often. The only places you can really find it is the parts of the male urethra and some glands. Male urethra and some glands. Some glands. There we go. And again, it secretes and protects. Secretes because it's columnar, it's going to make stuff, and protects because there's many layers. Now we've got this final strange one, transitional epithelium. This is where you've got different types or shapes of epithelia. So you're going to have some squamous, some cuboidal, some columnar, and it's like that because it allows for the tissue to change shape. If there's a whole bunch of different cell shapes there, it means that this tissue can distend and warp, and it's not going to damage it. So it's there in areas for expansion and distension. Now, what cavity or open area do we need to expand and distend? That's going to be our bladder. So you find this type predominantly in our bladder. And this is a quick run through of the different epithelial types.